get to the best part of today, our speaker. Today, we are so honored and fortunate to be joined by Jim Warren, and he is a member of the Oglala Lakota Sioux Nation, president of Warrior Society Development, where he does consulting for government agencies, nonprofit organizations, tribal nations, higher education institutions, and his experience includes congressional testimonies, cultural diversity and workforce inclusion, grant and organizational development, film production, actor, stuntman, and professional football player. That's just to name a few. We could go on for the rest of the day on just the incredible accomplishments of Jim. And a couple of, actually, through his film division, he's produced the 7th Generation documentary, award-winning documentary. His latest production is Remembering the Children. But what I would like to go into next, and I think there's no better way to do an introduction than to share with you a piece of his inspiring work. So next, we're going to share a short film. It's Emmy nominated, Oyate Ituwapi, Pictures of My People, which was featured on Fox NFL pregame show on Thanksgiving 2020, as well as on Fox Voices on MLK Day 2021. The MLK Day is the one that we'll be watching next. Can you pull up the video?
Over the last year, we've seen the power the sports world has to create change, and that's why we're here today. It's fitting that on Martin Luther King Day, we're debuting Fox Sports Voices. Dr. King's fight for respect encompassed all cultures. In fact, he worked with Native American tribes in Alabama in the late 1950s and wrote about the genocide of indigenous peoples in America in the early 60s. This past year, we saw a little dignity brought to Native Americans when the Washington football team decided to no longer use them as mascots. Yet, as ex-NFL player Jim Warren told us in a piece that first aired on Thanksgiving, there's far more to the struggles of his fellow Native Americans than just the team name.
I never did play for a team with a Native mascot, but I played against teams with Native mascots. So obviously I was a target of people that wanted to say things like scalp the Indian or cut your hair. When we hear that term red skin, we know that it's a term of our pelts, our scalps, that were bounties that were paid to bounty hunters. This negative imagery is getting most of the press, yet there's deeper issues in Indian country. We learn a lot about genocide in other countries, but we don't learn about the genocide that happened here. Back in 1890, the 7th Cavalry really wanted to get us back for Custer's last stand. When you look at the Wounded Knee grave site, my family is number 18 on that list of families that perished that day. Being an American citizen, many of us don't have that experience of visiting a mass grave, of feeling that trauma from many generations ago. Pine Ridge, my home reservation, is the poorest county in the United States. So the average family income is under $10,000 per year. Unfortunately, Indian country has the highest rate of COVID-19 in the world. And when I go home and I hear of the people that are passing away just because they can't keep themselves warm, that's something that's very challenging. When you think of Paha Sapa, which means Black Hills, that's our sacred land. U.S. policy saw that our culture, our ceremonies were savage and heathen. So we could have been singing a song for happy birthday or a wedding, and they saw it as war drums. Black Elk said it would take 7 generations to heal our circle after Wounded Knee. So as we gather on this special holiday, let's give thanks for inclusion. Let's give thanks for culture. Let's give thanks for who we are as two-leggeds.
The movement continues. In December, the Cleveland Indians announced that they will change the team name after the 2021 baseball season. For Michael Strahan and everyone involved, I'm Kurt Menefee. Thank you for watching.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
And now, without further ado, I will turn it over to Jim Warren, our speaker for today. We're so excited to hear from you today, Jim.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate that wonderful introduction. And thank you that we have quite a lot of folks attending today. So it's wonderful to have you with us for Decolonizing the Holidays. I really enjoy that title. And thank you so much for the comments and regarding the short film I was able to make with Fox Sports. And it was a wonderful invitation from Fox Sports. Initially, they wanted me as an actor, as a Screen Actors Guild actor, and I refused, saying that this is a story from my perspectives, my teachings as an indigenous advocate and educator and filmmaker. So I wanted to be co-producer as well as writer and have some control of the content. So that was wonderful to be able to have that opportunity to share my story and ensure that the indigenous aspects of that story that was shared on Thanksgiving, as well as Martin Luther King, got through to the audience. So 33 million people saw it on Thanksgiving. So I'm sure that was a decolonizing the holidays moment for them, thinking of Thanksgiving differently, particularly on the Thanksgiving holiday. And I think we all are experienced in our first grade teachings on American Indian 101 with cutting out the pilgrim hats and feathers for Thanksgiving at first grade. So we're already kind of sharing that myth of the holidays regarding indigenous people of this country during the Thanksgiving holiday. So that's always kind of an interesting element when we gather for family for Thanksgiving. Indigenous families definitely have a different perspective of Thanksgiving, if you will, in terms of the pilgrims and the tribal members that gathered that day, which is a beautiful story of intercultural relations and providing that assistance and resources that we do with, you know, United Nations and things like that today. So that was a nice story, but unfortunately is not the reality. And again, I'm glad that there was some slides shared to show that sometimes when we teach history and perspectives from the perspective of that culture, it can be much different than what we learn in our school systems or the myths that we have out there in society as to who we are as human beings. For instance, we just watched something on the old Redskins mascot, and then shortly thereafter, after Thanksgiving, when this aired, Cleveland decided to change their names. So again, outside of the diehard fans of those teams, that a friend of mine went to a Cleveland Guardians game, And a lot of the fans were saying, bring back the tribe. We don't like the Guardians. We want the Indians back. And the same thing's happening at the at Washington Commanders games. But for, you know, somehow those teams are still making money and are profitable. And, you know, those are like Stanford, I always bring up, used to be Stanford Indians as well. And somehow they survived and still have accreditation as a university. And I always like bringing that up because my brother Don is a graduate of Stanford Medical School. And I'm very proud of my brother, by the way. Dr. Don Warren just is the first American Indian to be hired at the Johns Hopkins Center for Indigenous Health. They just changed their name from American Indian Alaska Native. But we're very proud of my little bro, as I say. We're just following in my mom's footsteps, basically, because at 83 years old, my mom is still teaching at South Dakota State University. She is what she says, she flunked retirement. So that's wonderful that she is still leading my brother and I as we are approaching our 60s. We just saw each other in Boston, and we were just going, wow, we're getting close to 60. That's amazing. But it's wonderful that we're still following mom's footsteps as an educator, as an advocate, as proud young Lakota men raised by a proud Lakota woman who knew who she was early in life. So I'm going to share my screen now and share a PowerPoint and some of the perspectives that I have, not only as an Oglala Lakota, but also with the many hats that I wear in terms of as an educator, as an advocate, and living my dream as a filmmaker. It's so wonderful to be able to do that and be able to live my dream so that I can, you know, you hear that cliche, living the dream. But I am so fortunate with these roles, with these titles that I have as an advocate, educator, and filmmaker, as well as elder in training, I like to say. I might be there already and just didn't get the memo, but you know, that role of elder is very important in Indian country. And that is a role that my brother and I and others are seeing my mother, Beverly Warren, show her role as an elder and a leader, and the role that our women had in our tribes. It wasn't all just patriarchal, but we had matriarchal impacts and balance. And I think we saw that need in our voting, that women voters were out there strong. So thank you, women, for representing. And we need more of our young women leaders out there to join us men so that we can balance the balance of perspectives in leadership. And I think that's very key, that we have not only more women, but more Indigenous women, because it's wonderful that we have an Alaska Native woman that just won, and we have Sharice was reelected, and Deb Haaland is our now leading the Department of Interior, the first Native person ever. And so BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, for the first time stands for, instead of bossing Indians around, it is actually Bureau of Indian Affairs. So we're very happy that we have some Native representation in the White House and some Native perspectives, because we're usually ignored because we're never at the table. We're usually on the table when they're cutting things and cutting programs and funding. So I just want to share with you some of my background from my family, and just to get things started from what we want for our future generations. This is what we all share as two-leggeds. Let us put our minds together and see what life we can make for our children. So I want you to keep this in mind as we learn together today an Indigenous version of not only Thanksgiving, but an Indigenous version of the land in which we live, the United States today. So this is something historically from Red Cloud when he visited the White House with 17 tribal leaders in 1872. My grandfather Stabber was with Red Cloud at the White House. And we were very fortunate as a family to find these photographs of my grandfather, who was with Red Cloud, representing our family in a good way. And that's something that we try to do again with the 7th generation philosophy. It's required by us as human beings, as two-leggeds, to represent our people 7 generations ago, as well as 7 generations ahead. So when you think of that continuum, what a responsibility we all have representing past generations as best as we can, as well as the future generations that we will never meet. Now, I'm a grandfather now, so I see the world much differently. And I have sons and grandsons, and then I just have my first granddaughter a few years ago. So I obviously have a new version and vision of what I want for young women in the future. So now I think that has helped me evolve. I've always been respectful of our women leadership. I was raised by a strong indigenous woman. I'm married to a strong indigenous Hupa woman from Northern California, and she's on her tribal council. So she's a true leader out there representing the Oyate, representing the people. And so she's up there now at tribal meetings doing her thing. We just got back from DC. So she flew back to her reservation and I flew back to our home here in San Diego. So we meet up when we can on the road, which we often do, which is wonderful. And again, you see here, my grandfather Stabber lived to the age of 70. And in the chat, does anyone know what the average life expectancy of Indian men nationally as well as on Pine Ridge? Does anyone know? I'll see if I can turn my chat on here. But does anyone know? Can anyone raise their hand? Well, pretty close there, Erica. Let me see. Yes, so on the reservation for Indian men is 47, and nationally for Indian men is 57. So isn't that an interesting dynamic of the reality of us living? Our life expectancy is just, that is a public health crisis. And people are not aware of that. And so that's why I'm always advocating for, we need to make sure that our Indian Health Service is funded at full capacity. And we need to ensure that our indigenous people have access to healthcare first and foremost, so that those horrible life expectancy numbers aren't continuing in 2022. So I ask for your help as fellow two-legged and human beings. Anytime you advocate for any of your causes, please identify that we want to make sure that Indian Health Services is funded at the full capacity so that our death rates aren't so horrible in comparison. So there's Grandpa Stabber in the full regalia. Here's who I'm named after. Tashunka Akan Wachakte in Lakota is kills on horseback in English. So I always say my government name is Jimmy Warren, and my name is Tashunka Akan Wachakte. And this is my other grandfather that my mom remembers singing every morning and every evening. When the sun came up and the sun went down, my mom heard prayer songs and honor songs and other songs telling stories of the 7 rights or 7 values of the Oglala, so that we can be balanced and good people that have that respect and honor and humility, all those elements of the Lakota way. My mom grew up with hearing this every morning with Grandpa Stabber singing these songs, and every evening. So she knew who she was as a strong Lakota young person, growing up with these cultural ways and stories, and having that ability to just know who she is as a Lakota person. And she tells a story in my film, my current film that's out, Remember the Children, about boarding schools. And I might have time to share that clip later, but she tells a story at 9 years old, her first trip to Rapid City. She was living in Indian camp at the time because Indians were not allowed to live in housing yet in Rapid City, South Dakota in the 40s when she was there. This continued into the 60s. But she tells the story of her first "No Indians Allowed" sign in a storefront window. You know how the storefront windows are lower to the ground? So it was right at her level as a small 8-year-old. And she stops and reads that sign knowing who she is as a Lakota, and then asking her dad is why are they doing this? And her dad very eloquently said, because they do not know who they are. And this was in the 40s. And I dare say, my mom says this all the time, is you still don't know who we are in many cases. And if you're products of American education and have not gone further into the history of who we are, then unfortunately you are part of that group that just does not understand who we are as Indian people. So hopefully in this short time, I can share some more stories and perspectives so you know who we are a little bit better as a result of this experience that we have together today. And here's Unchi, Grandma, May Stabber Featherman, and you see she's holding an infant there that we're celebrating with the horse in full regalia. Unfortunately, this infant did not survive, as so many do not back then, as well as, you can also look that up, as infant mortality rates. Currently out of University of South Dakota, Oyate Circle, where I created a Native Disability Center, we're working with Region 8 Maternal Child Health and identifying these issues, and they see this as a crisis, and we're a young population. So there's a lot of young newborns out there facing these challenges of mortality rates. So our family was not an exception, and we experienced that as well. So again, here's mom and dad on their wedding day in 1962. So happy, wonderful day, obviously. But this is when they found out that still they could not rent a home in Rapid City. There was still no signs out in public in view, but it was the obviously the attitudes of the homeowners is no, we will not rent to Indian people. Therefore, I grew up in Arizona. But fortunately, mom brought me back, my brother and I, and there's me. You can see I'm a kind of a big baby there, but Grandpa Louie and Grandma Eva is holding me there on Pine Ridge Reservation. And you see the Quonset hut. So that was a lot of the abandoned military housing where multiple Indian families would live together on the reservation. So that was a wonderful reality that mom did for us. Was every summer, at least once a year, if not twice a year, we were on Pine Ridge learning Lakota ways, learning the language, the culture, the protocol of who we are as Lakota people. So there you can see the map of Indian country in the southwest corner of South Dakota. And there's my home nation, if you will, now is Pine Ridge. And you see the Black Hills and Rapid City up in the upper corner. And then our neighboring tribe, Rosebud, the Shichangu tribe is there, but they are also Lakota, and we are Lakota. And then the other tribes in South Dakota are Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota. And they call us the Great Sioux Nation or the Great Sioux Empire because of our tribes that were together and that we represented warrior nations. And you always hear about us in the historical battles and things of that nature. Here is one of the boarding schools. This is the Pine Ridge boarding school where my mom went to school in the 40s. And she recalls that morning of classes and the afternoon of working in the fields, because the expectation is let's make sure they know a little bit of English and become Americans, but we will still utilize them for manual labor. And I'm not sure if folks are aware of this, but it was legal for these government-run boarding schools that were often administered by churches to literally kidnap Indian children and take them to these schools for forced assimilation. So this was lucky families that knew where their children were, and they would make camps near the school so they could see their children from afar and visit if they were lucky. So this is a reality of the boarding schools that my mom experienced and tells very many harsh stories of the abuse that happened at these schools. And some of you may have heard that the Pope was in Canada this summer apologizing about their residential schools. They call them reserves instead of reservations in Canada. But they're uncovering all the thousands of children in unmarked graves not only in Canada, but now here in America. So the Pope was there acknowledging what the church did and their role in killing many of these children. They did not acknowledge the United States schools, and there were over 400 of these schools in the United States. So here's Indian camp, Oshkosh camp, where Mom grew up in Rapid City because we were not allowed to live in houses. This is what she remembers, having a tent and then eventually kind of a makeshift structure of wooden pallets and things that adjoined the tent. But this is where my mom was able to grow up and live so that she could go attend school. So this is Indian camp, where folks worked at the lumber company nearby, as well as in the kitchens. My mom washed dishes for 7 years, starting from age 13 or 12 in that area. She washed dishes in the same kitchen, but she was working there many years to help support the family as her dad, my grandfather's, working at the lumber yard. So this is good memories for her because it was all Lakota. So it was Lakota language, it was Lakota people. It was a Tioshbaye, a community, if you will, right there on Rapid Creek, nearby Rapid City, South Dakota at the time. And here you see her over 60 years ago. She became an RN. And there she is just a couple years ago, holding that photograph in front of the same school, which is a Catholic school. So she had fortunately met some good nuns there that believed in her and helped her get scholarships so that she could attend school and become an RN. So she did survive the abuse from the Pine Ridge Indian boarding school, where it was designed to take our culture away, but fortunately found some good mentors, non-Indian allies, as I like to call you, our friends out there that value us as Indigenous people and want to be able to be part of and have us part of the American system as well. So there's Mom still, and she's got 4. When she started, well, she tried retirement from Arizona State nursing, and then South Dakota State found out she was there back home, and they only had 4 Indian nurses at the time. 6 or 7 years ago, she started the Native American Nursing Education Center, and that she designed and runs, and she is the lead mentor for the students. She has 4 Native students alone graduating this year, and over 40 Native students as a result of her presence at South Dakota State University. So we're very proud of Mom still out there doing her thing, and there's her program of recruitment, retain, graduate, and get them licensed and out there working. And the majority of those nurses, they are Native, and they go back home to their home communities, to their reservations, or whatever the situation may be tribally, but they go back home and provide those services. So as an educator, mentor, advocate, I wear many hats, and I've been very fortunate in my role as an educator and advocate and athlete that I get to be able to have unusual experiences going to the White House and things of that nature. My wife was just at the White House 2 days ago, representing her tribe as a tribal leader. So it's fortunate that we have Native people, and what made me so proud was how many young people were there representing us in a good way. And Black Elk was right. The 7th generation after Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890 is here. So our young ones are representing that 7th generation philosophy in a good way, because they're stepping up not only as successful in business or education or what have you, but they're also stepping up with language, with singing and drumming and representing their culture. They're screaming for that knowledge, and it's our responsibility to provide that information and that structure, if you will, that my mom got back home when she grew up. So all of us are responsible for that if you have the 7th generation philosophy. So in these different roles that I get to play, here is Deb Haaland that I mentioned earlier. We had breakfast with her before one of our meetings there at Congress. And what a wonderful opportunity to have our first ever Native person at the Department of Interior. It's a wonderful celebration, but it's also an indictment that it took until 2020 to have a Native American leading Bureau of Indian Affairs in our interior. So let's hope that becomes the regular practice now that we have Native people, real Native people, if you will. I often call some of our Native people, you know, that don't know who they are, that claim to have Native blood but aren't members of any tribes, the wannabes. And bless their hearts, they want to be Native, but they don't have membership of the tribe. So you see all the four of us, we all have membership in our tribal nations in this picture. So that's very important when you are working with Native people to ensure that they are actually tribal members and have that representation. This is a program I started at San Diego State University. I'm a graduate of San Diego State. I'm a beach bum Lakota, I like to call myself, and I ended up making this my home. And it's wonderful to be here in Kumeyaay country. I heard in the chat, someone identified that they're here in Kumeyaay country. So I have someone from San Diego in the audience out there, so hello. And it's just wonderful that we're doing that land acknowledgement so that we are identifying the actual first people that were here on these lands. And this was the Pet Air program, a certificate program that I had 150 different Native students get their certificates, and 17 of them used their units to transfer and get their masters. Now I'm at University of South Dakota. I thought I retired from academia to focus on film work and consulting, but I got a contract to work with University of South Dakota to start similar programs that I did at San Diego State. And they got started, and then they asked me to administer them part-time for a couple of years. Well, now I'm 5 years in, almost 6 now, and I'm still part-time there, but what a wonderful reality for me to start these programs from San Diego. And now we have another one in Arizona at the Arizona School of Medicine. So as a Sun Devil, there's some catharsis for me to work with the Wildcats down south, but they're doing good things for tribal members with disabilities. So now we have our first ever Native Center for Disabilities, and this is a Finds Their Way youth program that we have. And it's just wonderful to be back in Arizona working with the Arizona tribes and providing better disability and advocate services for tribal members in Arizona. So I'm very proud of this Hall of Fame that I was inducted to in 2021, the Susan M. Daniels Disability Mentoring Hall of Fame class. And I accepted this in honor of my father, Jim Sr. That's why I work in disabilities, is the strongest man I know just happened to use a wheelchair and have MS. So he was quite an example for me, obviously, because here I am still working in the field of disability. And it was such a wonderful honor to be identified as a mentor for disability, because I see the culture of disability and our indigenous cultures very similar, because both of our cultures are misunderstood. Both of our cultures need federal acts for inclusion and justice, for self identity, and just having that ability to have that inclusion in society is very similar for the disability culture as well as our indigenous culture. So what is Indian country? What do you think Indian country is? Depending where you're from, it's going to vary. Some of the states, 15 states, don't have reservations or Indian land anymore. Those tribes are effectively eliminated and no longer exist in those areas as tribal nations. So Indian country is unique. And this is a myth quiz that I won't put you through, but you can just look through here and just see some of the things that I hear. This was made by Carleen Anderson and myself years ago. Just some of the things that we hear regarding myths of Indian country. So take a moment and take this quiz, true or false. You know, there's still that recessive gene theory that many have that we are automatically alcoholics. We are not. We're human beings like any other two-legged. You know, the alcoholism is a big aspect for us, but any impoverished group that faces high alcoholism and unemployment have high substance dependency. So it's not because we're Native people, it is the circumstance that many of our people are living. Here, just what do you think of number 2? When were we practiced? When was it legal for us to do our sweat lodges and our sun dance and our different grass dance and stomp dance that my wife does up in Hoopa? When did we have the legal ability to do this? Does anyone want to guess? I always tell my non-Indian students, assume the worst, and most likely you'll be correct. So if you guess 1978, C, you are correct. Some of the religious, and it's even mistitled because we don't have a word for religion in our indigenous languages, like we do not have a word for disability in any of our indigenous languages. So some of the sun dances and things that I attend back home were illegal literally in my lifetime. So that's something that, you know, we're constantly trying to work with our federal government, and often the Supreme Court cases are related to tribal sovereignty. It's been estimated that 10% of Supreme Court cases impact Indian country in some capacity with sovereignty, with jurisdiction, tribal lands, tribal nation status. And how do we relate with our state and municipal governments? It's a very unique and diverse relationship that we have. The Oklahoma tribes are different than what we have in California here, with many self-governance and public law 280. I'm a treaty tribe. So we have our treaties that we rely on that are constantly being challenged by our government. So we always have to go to Supreme Court level to make sure that our sovereignty is protected in the system. So this is what Chief Justice Marshall calls us as domestic dependent nations. I don't like that title, but at least it identifies that we are nation status. And we are identified in the Constitution many times as nation status. So again, as I mentioned, 15 states don't have tribal nations. So that's already 30 senators that don't have to vote for anything related to Indian country. So I'm going through these quickly just because it's kind of the just the legal aspects of who we are as nations, as sovereign nations within the United States of America. As I said, as the Lakota, I'm a member of the Ocheti Shakoi. So that's a bigger nation status than just our nation on our reservation as Oglala Lakota. Similar to the Six Nations that I work with quite a bit, the Senecas, the Mohawks, and the others as well. So let me move forward here a little bit. Here's Indian country in the United States now. So 96% of the land we did lose in the 400-year war. So after Wounded Knee, there was just a few more wars after that. Wounded Knee was a massacre, it was not a battle. So at that point is when we stopped fighting the US government in war with the Department of War. And then the past 100 years, just over 100 years, it's been the assimilation efforts through boarding schools, through termination and relocation, so many aspects in history. And at I was just in San Francisco 10 days ago for the American Indian Film Festival, showing my film, Remember the Children, but we also got to see some other great films, which we always do. And we got to see one on Alcatraz. I don't know if any of you remember 50 years ago, last year was the 50-year anniversary of the occupation of the Alcatraz Island from American Indian movement, where tribal members took that island over for nearly 2 years and lived there and had a lot of press internationally. America kind of ignored the issue until the international press got involved. And then things like termination and relocation started to end because that's what we were protesting. So, and there's our Alaska Native villages, our relatives up south in the cold country of Alaska. So they have different status. Here's some of the populations. Arizona and South Dakota, the two schools of medicines that I work with, have significant tribal populations that I work with. In California, the population isn't as high, but there's 117 different tribal nations that are recognized in California alone. So there's home for me, Pine Ridge. And this is what, this is the Pine Ridge Reservation. So these are my homelands, if you will, now. And this is something where I love to go home to get my recharge, to attend the ceremonies. But this was the original Oceti-Sakowin territories, if you will. You see the blue circle is Sioux Falls there, but the Lakota Nation was on the other side of the Dakotas. The Dakota Nation was the first contact nation. Nakota was the river people going up and down the river. Many of them are up north in Canada now. So this was the original areas of the Oceti-Sakowin. My brother makes the point, if the invaders were coming from the west, we would be north and south Lakota, just from the mere point that we were the first nation that they fought. But our Dakota brothers and sisters were the first, and we honor them being the first to protect our eastern borders as the military kept working their way west. So there's home, Pine Ridge Reservation. I always use this because Big Bats is one of our 3 or 4 gas stations I think we have now. But if you want some good chicken or buffalo burgers, stop by there. But you see Pine Ridge is our main village, and then Wounded Knee right there in the middle is where I always go to honor my family. So that's something that is unique to Indian country. Something else I want you to come away with is the diversity of Indian country. Because as you see here, Hoopa is much different than my lands up in Northern California. So this is my wife's lands. And this is a picture of me and my wife when she was on tribal council when we first were dating and engaged. And now she's back to tribal leadership in her role as a grandmother. But she's wearing her traditional outfit, and you can't see my tuxedo is beaded. So we were both representing as young people that I was so proud to see at the White House the other day. But we were young people too, representing as best we could before we were, becoming grandparents and elders in training, if you will. So it's wonderful that we had that experience at the presidential ball, but at least 20 times our non-Indian allies, mostly white, go, "Oh, are you Indian people? Can we take your picture?" So after about 15 times, I go to Jill, I go, "Hey, follow my lead." And I go up to this white family, I go, "Hey, are you white people? Can I take your picture?" So you have to have fun, with it sometimes, because people just don't know who we are. That's a reality. And here's California with the multitude of tribes in California. So it was wonderful to see different tribal nations in the land acknowledgements this morning. And here's San Diego County, in which I live now in Kumeyaay land. So I'm a beach bum Lakota in San Diego. And here's where the diversity of Indian country comes through. This is the Hollywood likes the Indian with the feather, right? Well, most tribes did not use feathers. Hoopa did not, as an example. So again, please know that the diversity of Indian country, we still have, nearly 600 recognized nations, and there's still over 100 tribal nations that were either terminated or were lost their sovereignty through some sort of federal court case. So there's over 700 tribal nations actually, and the recognized ones, the federally recognized tribes have that sovereign status. And then there's some state recognized tribes that have their status, particularly with that independent state. And that's something to be very aware of, is we must keep our federal status, and those federally recognized tribes need to make sure those treaties and all of those agreements that we made with our past history are honored. And just real quick, before I end, I want to share this. What happened in 1492? Does anyone know where Columbus stepped foot in America? Where did he land? Anybody? Well, the Caribbean, all right, someone knows. Columbus never stepped foot in America. He was lost in the Caribbean trying to find India. So if you, at least another element of some of the things that we have, Dominican Republic, yes, the Bahamas, yes. So that's where he was. So I'm so glad that many people know that, because so many people still think Columbus stepped foot in America. He never did. It was the indigenous people of the Caribbean, which he named the West Indies as a result of being lost. So now it's the West Indies, but he was down there, and then now Colombia, where he, I think on his fourth voyage, he made it down to what is now Colombia. So again, when you think of that history, always think of, there's a lot of myths about who we are as Native people. And I'm running out of time, so I can't share everything, but I want to close with an unfortunate reality is the land rush. When you think of manifest destiny, it was the justification to kill the buffalo and to kill the indigenous people and to get that free land. So the Sooners, the Oklahoma Sooners, they were the Sooner to the land. That is that's what Sooners mean in their wagon. So here's a famous portrait painted of a beautiful blonde white angel going across, leading the pioneers across the new world, and the native, indigenous, and the buffalo people running for their lives. This is what my Tahanshi, Wayne Weston, created. And this is what we need to get back to as we have disrespected Unchimaka, Grandmother Earth. We must come back to some of our tribal ways, our indigenous ways, because Mother Earth is not happy with us and we are not listening. We must listen to Unchimaka. We must do something in order to bring back some of those tribal philosophies, living in unison in respect with Mother Earth, with our four-legged brothers and sisters, with our river relatives and our root nation. We must respect Mother Earth and get back to that philosophy. So I believe I'm out of time, and I will stop now. Stop share, let me see here. And I hope you learned something about Indian country and what some of our perspectives are. I'm a Lakota living in San Diego that grew up in Arizona, and I'm a pavement Indian, you know, urban Indian, but I was raised to be a strong Lakota man and to represent as best as I can. And that's what we all have, is we want our future to be better, in my case, for my grandchildren. And we all have that as human beings, as two-leggeds. So let's concentrate on that aspect as we join for the holidays. And please identify Indian country in some way in a positive fashion with your family together. Just identifying maybe the original tribe of the lands in which you live, just so that becomes a tradition of Thanksgiving versus the myth of Thanksgiving. So I want you to have a nice decolonized holiday. And thank you for that title. I love that title. Well done to the crew here. And thank you so much for the invitation. Palamia washtelo, Ogate washte. Thank you, good people, for this wonderful day.
Thank you so much, Jim. This has been amazing. I hope that everyone is walking away with the historical content that we received today. I think that that is what is important when we talk about decolonizing the holiday. The root of that is really understanding the true meaning behind what is happening and what we are celebrating versus what we were told and what we were taught. So we're trying to change those narratives. We have lots of questions here, and we only have a little bit of time, so I'm going to try and pull as many as I can. I do want to say, Jim, we had someone state that there's a lot of information here and they wanted to know if they can receive the slides. So I don't know if that's something that you would be able to share, but if so, we can chat with you about that after. And if that is available, we'll make sure and
I'll try to remember which ones I shared, but
and then we'll have the recording as well.
Okay.
So I'm just going to pull a couple of questions here. One is that we received is, do you know of any movements to gain more resources such as electricity and clean water to tribal lands?
Oh my, yes. That's huge, particularly for my wife in Hoopa on the Trinity River. And she was there in DC as a self-governance tribe with other tribal leaders. And they have a lawsuit actually with the Department of Interior because the water is not being agreed to correctly with their agreements with the non-Indian governments. So too much of their water is being taken for the farms and the deserts of the lower California. So that's a big issue, is water issues, and that's going to be our future human crisis. So let's just prepare. Mother Earth will give us that one to hopefully learn from. But water is life. And so I'm so glad that my wife is there as a tribal leader to ensure that Northern California waters and the fish, in particular the salmon, are protected. And then with Mother Earth giving us the message with the warming of the river, you can see a lot more moss and things of that nature in the river that we did not see a generation ago. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. And then we just have time for one more, and I kind of wanted to make sure that we effectively wrapped up everything that you shared today. So for those leaders, educators, and just individuals within organizations as a whole, what steps do you think that they can take, even if it's just very primary steps that they can take towards decolonizing the holidays? Because what you shared really helps us in starting to evaluate what we do personally and within our spheres of influence, but what can we do in our classrooms or in our organizations?
And I see real quick there something, what is decolonization? And that's a big thing for us in Indian country, you know, and the colonizers, you even heard it on Black Panther movie, you know, hello colonizer. And so many of that's an indigenous perspective of the colonizing, invading countries that came to completely change who we are. So colonization, a product of that is the boarding schools. So colonizing those young Native students, those children, through the boarding schools was a way of colonizing us so that we would think American and forget indigenous. Fortunately, my family was very strong, where my uncle at 9 years old, the kids would pile on him because the priests were beating him so bad. And they just said, you got to escape, Larry. So every one of those students stole a little bit of food for him, and that night gave him a pack of food. So at 9 years old, he walked 3 days to get back home. But thousands of those kids died in those decolonizing schools. So again, those are hard stories to tell. What you want to tell is, hey, it's wonderful to see how Indian country and indigenous people are now being recognized better and more accurately. And now we can discuss them at the table at Thanksgiving in a good way. And of course, we cannot forget the history, and that was the design of our curriculum, was let's forget the genocide and let's see if we can move on and forget. Well, nope, we're going to remember and move forward together, because once we know that history, we can learn from it and understand why we have terms like decolonizing the holidays. So again, that's something where it goes beyond curriculum, unfortunately, because only one state, Montana, requires Indian studies. And I hope we have more in the future of other states saying, let's learn what these lands are. Why do we do land acknowledgements? Why are we recognizing these tribes that we thought disappeared long ago, but we are still here? 90% of us died as a result of European contact, but the 10% of us that survived are strong indigenous people. And that's what I'm seeing now with our young generation. And it's wonderful to be an elder in training and a grandpa to see that personally. So I'm glad I'm living, I want to be that outlier and live longer than the statistics prove, so I can be a grandpa and just witness this evolvement of Indian people and just more of us represented, you know, like an Alaska Native woman being elected in Alaska for the first time to the House of Representatives. It's just nice to see that seventh generation philosophy is coming true. So remember, represent your past generations. You may not know your original languages anymore. Many of our Euro-American allies and friends don't remember or weren't taught your language. And that's okay, because that was by design. Well, they wanted us to stop our languages, but we refuse. We will keep our languages going. So with that note, Metakiwe Oyase, we are all related. We are all two-legged. So that's the message of holidays when we get together, not only as families, but to value other people that may be different.
Thank you so much. What a perfect ending. There's nothing more that I can say that would close it and wrap it better than that. Thank you all for being with us today. We hope that you have walked away with a wealth of information. I know that I sure have.